Learn about biblical background stuff, you're in the right place. If you're not, buckle up. I'm starting. Okay, so we can't really talk about a golden age of biblical literature because it's all kind of amazing. Right? Isaiah is like the gospel before the gospel, and that's written in the Neo-Assyrian period. The minor prophets will step on anybody's toes. Ezra and Nehemiah, written in the Persian period, they have been inspirational books for as long as any of us have been alive, right? So you can't really talk about the golden age, but what you can talk about are really special people. And here at this point, we come to the section of biblical literature that was written around the time and in part tells the story of really special people. And that is the early divided monarchy and the united monarchy, right? David and Solomon, these names by themselves have carried entire books and sections of biblical literature. They were beautiful people. Now, when we are talking about the stuff written in the early monarchy, okay, the period of time that we're talking about, the united monarchy only has 3 kings: Saul, who was succeeded by David, who was succeeded by Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam just can't do the job, and so the kingdom splits into 2, right? I'll put Saul, for the purposes of this class, I'll put Saul at the mid to end of the 11th century, okay? The mid to end of the 11th century would be 1050 BC moving forward, right? Because we're counting down before Jesus. So 1050 BC to 1000 or so is the last half of the 11th century. David, so this is free with your tuition. We date Solomon based on dating Assyrians, and we date Assyrians by astronomy. And it's not a perfect system, but ultimately we find Solomon and then we just kind of count backwards from people. So, based on traditional dating for David, he is born around 1040 BC. He becomes king in 1010 BC. Or so, and Solomon reigns he reigns for several years, and then Solomon's reign probably ends in around 930 something like that. So we're dealing with probably not around a century, right? 3 different generations of people. Around a century of time for the early monarchy. Roughly. I didn't do the math. You know why? Because I hate math. I hate it so much. I don't like to count, so don't make me do it too often. But there are a number of documents that are associated either directly or traditionally with David and Solomon in particular. Saul, I've never actually seen a model that portrays any specific literary endeavor to the days of Saul or to Saul himself. However, we should not be surprised to see Hebrew kings with literary capability. In fact, literacy was an intended prerequisite for the Hebrew king. Let me pull up for you, and I'm sorry that I did not have time to translate it, so I'm just going to be using the New American Standard 1995 update. But Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 through 20. Oh my goodness, typing is so hard. Deuteronomy 17, 18 through 20. Now it shall come about when Moses has already been talking about a king. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of Levitical priests, It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. So literacy was an intended prerequisite for what was acknowledged as an eventual expectation that the Hebrews would have a king. More specifically, Deuteronomy 17 sets a specific requirement that the eventual king write out a copy of the law himself, and that process be witnessed by Levitical priests. We do not know how many Hebrew kings did this. Presumably, the practice was limited to the kings of Judah once the kingdom split, because the northern kingdom embraced paganism pretty much off the bat. But the practice had also obviously been abandoned in Judah by Josiah's day, because it would not have been such a big deal to find somebody else's copy of the law sitting in the temple if Josiah had written his own at some point. So Josiah clearly didn't do that, and he's in the Neo-Assyrian period. It is possible that King Saul had to do this, that King Saul was submitted to Deuteronomy, and he had to write out a copy of the law at some point. That's possible. It is plausible, if not probable, that David and Solomon would have submitted to this instruction. The literature that we have associated with them, one of the themes is celebrating the law of God. The idea that they would spend hours and hours and hours writing the things that celebrated the law of God, and then have a commandment to write a copy themselves and have never gotten around to it, seems a little, awkward. So it's probable that David and Solomon each wrote a copy of the law. In any case, Deuteronomy 17 preserves a specific expectation that the Hebrew king would contribute at least to the preservation of the authoritative religious literature of God's chosen people. They're expected to help with the library, The literary record of David and Solomon, however, suggests that those two at least, went above and beyond and ended up writing some of the most long-cherished literature in the world. Now, that said, establishing the fact that we can expect David and Solomon to have written things, I'm going to try to present to you the order in which these things might have actually appeared. And at least the earliest thing, maybe, this is all a maybe, chronology-wise, order-wise, the earliest thing that might have been written in the early monarchy, in the United Monarchical period, is at least part of Genesis 36. And this may be a surprise to you. You're like, wasn't Genesis finished? Well, I thought that too, until I read the whole thing. See, Genesis 36 is a section that immediately follows the death of Isaac in the narrative. And what it amounts to is whatever happened to baby Esau. It gives the whole history of and it's contained in how we break up modern Bibles by chapter and verse. It's all just Genesis 36 is this self-contained unit. And it's all about Esau. What is really interesting is that when you get to Genesis 36, verse 31, you get this phrase, and I'm still reading from the NASB 95. Now, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the sons of Israel. Say, what? Yes, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the sons of Israel. The fact that there is a reference to Israel having a king, and that would almost certainly be the united monarchy, right, and not the northern kingdom of Israel later, raises the possibility that they had Genesis, and then during the time of the united monarchy, somebody was allowed to go in there, allowed by God, because I do believe that God overwhelmingly protects His Word. And I think the way we have the Bible now is some solid circumstantial evidence for that. But somebody was allowed to go in and either add to, either update the whatever happened to baby Esau section by adding in the kings that had come from him before the monarchy had gotten started, or the entirety of chapter 36. Let's not forget about Esau is shoved in there. So that reference to the king of Israel and the kings of Edom that preceded a king being in Israel moves at least that one section of Genesis, or maybe just that one part of that one section of Genesis, into the early monarchy. And as you will see, once we get to the wisdom literature that we're covering today, this kind of thing is not necessarily unique to Scripture. Now, the second, perhaps, the second thing that would happen in history, in terms of all the people that we're talking about today, Joshua would have come after the events of Genesis, right? The events of Exodus follow in time the events of Genesis. The events of Joshua come at the end of the Exodus, right? How many of you are familiar? I want to see hands. How many of you are familiar with the phrase Deuteronomistic history? Crickets, 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 crickets. Okay, well, this is kind of important because one of the things that we're really trying to focus on in this class is why did these books appear when they appeared, right? Especially when we were talking about the New Testament, we were able to talk about the circumstances in which different books of the New Testament popped up by the different writers, the different reasons that Paul might have written letters to different folks. And we talked about how, after and before the exile, there's this need to recapitulate on the history, on the royal history of the nation. However, I'm just going to throw this out there to you. The Deuteronomistic history is an academic theory. And it is a theory that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one work. And that time has just kind of separated them out. This is generally based on matters of Hebrew syntax and a strong relationship, a strong shared focus on using Deuteronomy. The reason why it's an academic theory is because it can be argued against, right? But when we talk about Joshua and Judges and the life of David and the pre-exilic royal history of Israel, there is a model out there that shoves all of those books into the Neo-Babylonian period. Or alternatively, the forms as we have them. It's not that the Deuteronomistic history depends on the idea that, not that no one cared to write about David until the 6th century, which would be really weird, right? Not that nobody cared to write about Joshua until the 6th century, but that the inspired stories that were actually the inspired editions of information about them came later. And the information that was written down about them earlier was not what we would call, canonical in the sense, right? So that's the whole issue. If you're preparing to study a Bible class and you're reading about Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and you see this phrase, Deuteronomistic history, and it's likely that you will, if you're interacting with commentaries on those books and that kind of thing, I just want you to be aware, that's what it's talking about. The idea that the books as we have them, the information about all those people, about Joshua and all the judges and David and all the kings, as we have them now, were actually written in the Neo-Babylonian period as part of this sweeping effort to take account of the entire nation of Israel from its beginning to its end, as they would have seen it at the exile, right? So that's the Deuteronomistic history. However, there are things that don't fit. It is very reasonable to assume that when or shortly after Joshua was alive, things were written about what had happened with Joshua. And Judges, I would argue, is not chronologically, you're looking at me this way. Here's Joshua. I would argue that Judges, if this is where Joshua ended, Judges doesn't just pick up chronologically. The first half of Judges actually looks at the same period of time as Joshua, just from a different perspective, and then the Judges come after. But in Joshua 6:25, Rahab is still alive. When Joshua 6:25 is originally written, regardless of if it ends up being part of some more polished Neo-Babylonian national history at the start of the exile later, Joshua 6:25 says, however, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day. So she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. To this day is not a phrase that should be overlooked when you're thinking about when documents were written. Because I feel very strongly about the fact that Rahab did not live to see the exile to Babylon. Hundreds of years later, she might have had a good long life, but she'd be competing with the patriarchs and their grandparents if she lived all the way from the conquest of Joshua and outlived David and outlived Solomon and outlived pretty much every king of Israel and Judah. So no. The issue with the Deuteronomistic history is the suggestion that there's a statement like that inside it, right? That when Joshua 6:25 is written, Rahab is still alive. And that limits when the story of Joshua is being told. What the Deuteronomistic history scholar will have to say at that point is that Joshua was already appreciated as scripture. You know, it was already appreciated as something that was not meant to be significantly altered or changed. So in putting together this monumental national history of Israel from beginning to end, you essentially have to say that it's a copy and paste that would have been seen as wrong to alter, right? So the Deuteronomistic history theory doesn't just go away. But the fact is, this statement about Rahab itself proves that stories were being written about Joshua within Rahab's lifetime, okay? And whether or not our book of Joshua exactly matches what was originally told is a matter of academic debate. However, at least an early version of the book of Joshua was certainly written in the early monarchy. If we do not have that very version. You know, either we have the Deuteronomistic history version, big national version at the end of the kingdom period, or we have the actual thing that popped up. Those are really our two choices. Now, that also goes with Judges. Judges is clearly not written during the period of the Judges. It constantly compares the way things are in the book of Judges to the time when there is a king. Before there was a king in Israel, every man was doing right in his own eyes. That phrase is actually repeated a couple of times. So we need to date the book of Judges to the monarchical period. And Judges and Joshua definitely go together. So if we date Joshua to the early monarchy period, we need to date Judges there as well. If we date Joshua to the national history at the beginning of the exilic period, then we need to put Judges there as well. But you're getting the pattern, I think. Now, 1st and 2nd Samuel. I've had one of the teachers that I respect most say that 1st and 2nd Samuel, essentially the life of David, is what those two books amount to. I've had a teacher that I respect very dearly say that 1st and 2nd Samuel is to Hebrew prose what the Iliad and the Odyssey are to Greek poetry. They, and in my far lesser experience with the books, I must say that I agree. These are ingeniously written works of literature. They are gorgeous in their composition and their thoughtfulness, and it is very unlikely that something so intentionally thoughtful about David's life, such intentional thought about David's life would not have been undertaken until the divided kingdom was ending, right? David is celebrated already. I certainly believe that, 1st and 2nd Kings were written after the divided kingdom has happened. And almost every king there that's good is compared to David, right? David is the celebrated king of the Old Testament. He is the standard by which other kings are judged. So the idea that the story of his life just waited until the end after years and years of comparison to him seems ridiculous to me. Again, it just comes down to whether the version we have of David's life is a polished version that came at the end of the divided kingdom, or it's just a great version that popped up shortly after David's life was over. Solomon could have overseen the writing of 1st and 2nd Samuel, right? But there's no doubt that the conversation about David was important. Who David was needed to be remembered. And if you're going to take away one of the things from this class in terms of like Christian practice, because I know there's not a lot of it in this quarter here, I will preach this. David and his life is worthy of our attention. That was understood and known in the ancient world, and it should be understood and known today. What it looks like to be a person after God's own heart is worthy of attention. What it looks like to be an imperfect person who will chase down God's will to the utmost of their limited human ability deserves our attention. And I have no doubt that something like that, so the appreciation of his example, is why the story of his life appears. And if the polished version that we have of it came at the end of the divided kingdom, then fine. But I do want you to be aware, there is an argument of dating 1st and 2nd Samuel to earlier than the Deuteronomistic history model in 1 Samuel 27:6. 1 Samuel 27:6 says, "So Achish gave David Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day." if 1st and 2nd Samuel, if David's life, as we have it, if this record of David's life, as we have it in the canon, should be dated before the Deuteronomistic history, it needs to be dated like to the days of Rehoboam, okay? The very start of the divided monarchy, because it says that Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. If, when 1 Samuel was written, the kingdom had not yet divided, it would have said the kings of Israel. But it says that Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah. So, when 1 Samuel is written, the kingdom is split. That said, there is an archaeological site that has been strongly argued as to be identified with Ziklag. It is called, where is it? Khirbet, here we go. Khirbet al-Rai. It was dug by the same man who's in charge of digging Lachish. And Khirbet al-Rai has a breaking point in its occupation. It has what we call a hiatus, a thing where nothing is happening. It has a hiatus in the second half of the 10th century or so. So that would be Rehoboam's day is when the hiatus starts. Now, what happened in Rehoboam's day was that Shishak, king of Egypt, was prompted by Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, to attack Judah. Turns out he attacked both Judah and Israel. Pharaohs do not behave the way you want them to all the time. But Shishak would have destroyed Ziklag based on the archaeology. However, Ziklag did not just die. Ziklag resumes occupation around 701 BC, the 8th century. And it exists as a continuous village all the way into the Persian period, because when Nehemiah is resettling folks, he mentions that some of the people are sent to repopulate Ziklag. So, Ziklag cannot be used as this marker. If Ziklag is Khirbet al-Rai, then it cannot be used in regard to 1 Samuel 27:6 just to say, oh, well, these had to be the kings of Judah before the site was destroyed, because Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah after the site was resettled and repopulated as well. So it could belong to later kings of Judah and not just Rehoboam. So, don't misuse archaeology. But, yes, all that to say, that is one argument that is actually used in the ESV Study Bible to insist that 1 Samuel should obviously be taken as dating to the time of Rehoboam. One, no archaeological association is 100%, right? If Khirbet al-Rai is not Ziklag, then we don't even know where Ziklag is, right? So one, you can't just choose to treat archaeology as this invincible identification machine. And two, the archaeology doesn't work with that model anyway. So then, let's say that Joshua, Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel are either written with 1st and 2nd Kings or written beforehand. That's really where we're at. When we get to my favorite book of the Old Testament, the story gets simpler. Ruth was certainly written in the early monarchy period. Ruth is, how many of you ever saw Christopher Reeve's 1978 Superman movie? Anybody? Oh, there's my people. There's my people. At the beginning of that movie, there's this whole scene about Krypton, right? With Marlon Brando playing Jor-El, Superman's dad. Ruth has a spiritual and meaningful function. It shows us God's love for the foreigner, right? But in a royal administrative context, Ruth is David's Krypton scene. Okay? It is this beautiful little book that is written to explain where David came from. And it's gorgeous. And if you're going to pick a person to be like other than Jesus in the Bible, pick Ruth or Boaz. You can't go wrong. This book is filled with beautiful people. And it's just, I could talk about Ruth all day. But yes, maybe that'll be my next class. The Book of Ruth. But yes, Ruth has no obvious historical function outside of explaining David's past. And it is not a reflection upon the kingdom of Israel, like Judges is in contrast. It is not a reflection of the start of the nation, like Joshua is. It is about the start of David. And the beautiful history that came out of Moab into Israel to give us this beautiful person and the beautiful people that he came from. So, yes, Ruth squarely belongs in the early monarchical period, and it's David's Krypton scene. Now, next, we get to Ecclesiastes, okay? I'm not saying that Ecclesiastes was written after Ruth. We're just talking about the bunch now altogether. Ecclesiastes is technically anonymous. However, it is really hard not to associate it with Solomon. On the one hand, the kingdom, on the one hand, he says that, he's a son of David, king in Jerusalem. That could be any of the kings of Judah, right? However, there are only so many good kings of Judah. There are a few. There is more than one, right? But once the kingdom splits, there are only so many good kings. And two, the state, the economic viability that the writer of Ecclesiastes has to have all these women and all these gardens and all these things, like people. The divided kingdom was predominantly a vassal state to Assyria and Babylon for most of its existence. The temple is repeatedly looted. Like the treasury of the temple is constantly sold out to pay off enemies. The economic status that is available to the king who wrote Ecclesiastes does not really fit anyone other than Solomon, who represents Israel's golden age, which brings up the question of why would it be anonymous? Well, one, if today something is written by, there's some press brief that starts out, the President of the United States, okay? You don't need to ask who it is. Like, you know who the President of the United States is right now. There's no need to specify. Desk of the President, Office of the President. It doesn't need clarification. You know by the date who the president is. If Ecclesiastes is written during Solomon's reign, there is no need for him to name himself. In fact, you can see from the text that while he identifies himself as king, that is not the role that the writer of Ecclesiastes is actually taking. His kingship is actually incidental. What he is doing is preaching. Qoheleth, or Ecclesiasticus, the one who is presenting the book of Ecclesiastes as he presents himself, is the one who is proclaiming something to an assembly. Ecclesiastes is a book written by someone who has something to say, and you're going to listen. This is why it's called what it is. The real debate over Ecclesiastes is whether the Hebrew, because the Hebrew syntax of Ecclesiastes is pretty distinct, whether it represents a later Hebrew or whether it represents a Hebrew dialect. If Solomon did write Ecclesiastes himself, the unique Hebrew of Ecclesiastes is actually how Solomon talked, which is pretty neat. It's his dialect. Alternatively, if it is not Solomon, in which case you run up against the historical issues of anybody else who could write it, then it's just later. It should be later. But then the Song of Songs is dated by geography. That is really fun because it's great when that happens. But the Song of Songs mentions that the woman is a Shunammite, and it also compares the town of Tirzah as in Song of Solomon 6:4, you are beautiful as Tirzah, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem. There's a parallel. Tirzah and Shunem both belonged to the northern kingdom after the kingdom split. So, because of the geography that is associated with Jerusalem and the woman who is in love, portrayed as in love with King Solomon in this, essentially, Song of Solomon is a play. It's a beautiful play. It's the Shakespeare moment of the Old Testament. But because the place the woman is from and another place don't belong to Judah anymore once the kingdom splits, this should be associated with the early monarchy. And thereby, it has to be Solomon himself is probably the writer of the book. And then Psalms. We do not have time to talk about Psalms and Proverbs at length. However, it is very important that in contrast between the two, there's discussion over whether or not we should take the superscriptions of the Psalms, a Psalm of David, etc., as inspired. You can talk about whether or not they are inspired. Everything that is inspired is historically accurate, that is trying to be historically accurate. That's part of the nature of inspiration. However, everything that is historically accurate is not necessarily miraculously inspired. I know this because some of my textbooks would be so much better if God wrote them. But even if they are accurate. However, but there is no psalm. There are a lot of orphan psalms that don't have a superscription, and those could have been added in later, right? But there is no named author of any psalm outside of the united monarchy. David, Solomon, the sons of Korah, who are the gatekeepers, Asaph, the chief musician, or who is associated. However, Psalm 74, which is associated to Asaph, talks about the destruction of the temple, right? Which did not happen in Solomon's day. So, in any case, the Psalms are difficult to date. However, the ones that are attributed lean heavily towards people that we know from the early monarchy. And then that's in contrast to Proverbs. Proverbs 25, verse 1 says, "These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed." And that is not some superscription. That is in the text. So, Proverbs, has things that are written by Solomon in it, but clearly the work that we have as the book of Proverbs should at least date to the time of Hezekiah, right? The Neo-Assyrian period. But I didn't talk about it in the Neo-Assyrian period because the contents are overwhelmingly weighted to a known active author from the early monarchy. That's really all we have time for. Are there any questions? Bueller, yes, sir.
So the king having to write a copy of the law, is that the first 5 books?
That's a great question, right? Deuteronomy says this law, and Deuteronomy is a summary of the rest of the Torah. So, did the king have to write Deuteronomy and then, have the Levitical priests go, "Good job"? Or did he have to write Genesis through Leviticus? Like, which did he have to do? Don't know. The entire Torah, I do not think, could have fit. Well, I say this, I'm not good with like scroll technology of the ancient Near East. That's not something I've looked into, but I think the question deserves to be asked if those could have all fit on one scroll in terms of the scrolls that they made at the time, right? Codices were not invented, spines and pages were not invented until the Roman period. So at what point do you just say, I need another scroll, please? When Josiah found one, he seems to have found a scroll of the law, not a bunch of them. So it's uncertain. Did he have to write Deuteronomy? Maybe. Did they have to write Genesis through Leviticus? Maybe. I don't know. That's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, you're dismissed. God loves you.